Abbey Archaeological Archive project. It discusses the difficulties faced and outlines the methodologies applied in unravelling the historic record. It draws out the archaeological evidence and challenges existing assumptions, which will be illustrated by a case study. The project covers the excavations undertaken between 1904 and 1979, the directors of which are all shown here. But I'll begin this paper by stating the main aims of our current project before outlining the impetus behind it and providing some background information. I'll then summarise the scope of the historic excavations against new trench plans for each of these directors, together with a statement regarding the limited publication records. I'll then assess the quality of the records and the difficulties that we've encountered in their interpretation. And this leads on to the methodology that I've developed to reassess and interpret the archive. The case study I've chosen is from Raleigh Radford's excavations in the 1950s and 1960s, and I'll be focusing on aspects of the Norman monastery and illustrating how the published record is being both critiqued and expanded. So the aims of this project are to first of all reassess and interpret all the known records and available records from 1904 to 1979. To create a digital archive that will be made publicly accessible through the Archaeological Data Service. And this will include the historic excavation records themselves, new excavation reports, new specialist reports, and relevant contents of the database that we've been using. To reassess all the excavated material that's been retained, so that's all the finds in addition to all the paper record. To obtain a framework of independent dating based on reassessment of the finds and radiocarbon dating of surviving organic material. To undertake a comprehensive geophysical survey to provide ground truth for excavation trenches and features, and to be able to begin to assess the surviving deposit. And to appraise the archaeological significance of the evidence for the Saxon and medieval monastery and for post-dissolution activity within the precinct. So the necessity of writing up the archive was first highlighted by Aston and Leach in 1977. However, the impetus behind this project was the death of Raleigh Radford in 1998 and the recovery of a large chunk of the archive from his home. The archive had been kept at his home because he was operating outside of a university or an institutional contest, but this effectively made the archive unavailable to other researchers. In 1999, the archive was deposited at the National Monument Record in Swindon, and Vicky Dawson, who was then the consultant curator at Glastonbury Abbey, commissioned an assessment undertaken by David and Evelyn Baker. They found Radford's record to be extensive, although in complete disarray, and they recommended full cataloguing, analysis and publication. Shortly after this, the Glastonbury Abbey Conservation Plan, produced by Keystone in 2004, reinforced the need for a major research project to research, interpret and make available the unpublished archaeological archive. So from 2007 to 2008, Roberta Gilchrist and myself undertook a pilot project funded by the British Academy and with the full support and assistance of Glastonbury Abbey. The NMR archive was properly catalogued and accessioned, and I also scanned all the drawings and photographs so that we had safety copies of everything. The pilot project included writing up one of the areas that had been excavated to test the quality and develop an appropriate methodology for a full project. And the Chapter House area was selected because it had been partially excavated by Bond in 1910, again by Wedlake in 1935, and several trenches, there was about 7 trenches, only 2 of them are shown on this slide, in 1956. So it would be a good test as how the records could be amalgamated and how we could reinterpret some of the earlier results in relation to what was found later on. And as part of this, we undertook a trial geophysical survey, and this proved to be invaluable in placing the archaeology within a broader spatial context for providing ground truth and for actually the archaeology verifying some of the geophysical results. So just a couple of examples. Ooh, hang on, sorry. Two of the trenches, CH1 and CH3, were imaged on the geophysical survey, and this actually confirmed where we had placed them using all the measurements on the original plans. This little wall here, labelled vestibule partition, this was imaged very clearly on the geophysics, and it corresponded with steps in our partition in the CH1 trench. And this proved the possibility that we had a western vestibule to the chapter house. Also, the location of the Saxon ditch and the Valham Monastery was imaged on the geophysics on the GPR, the ground penetrating radar survey, and this actually corresponded with the section across the ditch. As part of the pilot project, the Abbey records were also catalogued, and they were found to contain important unpublished material relating to the non-Radford excavations. One of the things we found was the original finds packaging from all the finds, little brown envelopes, and the chapter house exercise demonstrated that it was possible to link finds to archaeological deposits and features once these had been properly mapped. And the significance of this is that for a full project, this would not only provide a degree of contextual information for the finds, but also indicated the potential for dating some archaeological deposits. The pilot project assembled a team to undertake specialist tasks, such as illustration, and I have to highlight Elizabeth Gardner here, who's responsible for much of the mapping and digitising you'll see today, a geophysical survey by GSB prospection, and analysis of the finds held at the Abbey, and the specialists you see here cover pottery, architectural stone, tile, window glass, small finds, Saxon glass furnace material, faunal remains, prehistoric Roman material, and the targeted scientific analysis applied to some of the materials. And we also have some volunteers, including Peter Points-Wright, who was one of the original volunteers in Radford's excavations. So the overall conclusion of the pilot was that the archive would benefit from modern post-excavation analysis. The results would allow the published literature to be properly critiqued, and that previously hidden archaeological evidence would be forthcoming. The Arts and Humanities Research Council granted funding for a full archive project, which began in 2009 and is now in the final stages. So I'm just going to take you on a very brief tour of the historic excavations and their publications. With much of the archive unavailable, previous mapping of the excavation trenches was largely based on the published material, such as this plan by Ratz and Watts incorporating a previous map by Aston and Leach. With the archive now available, our new plan incorporates original excavation plans and draws on evidence contained within the archive. So you can see we have an awful lot more trenches than previously shown and an awful lot more complex. The locations of many of the trenches have been cross-referenced against excavation photographs, which have been now linked trenches. So, for example, to illustrate, we did have some difficulties with plotting the 1954 trenches in the cemetery area shown here. The diagonal trench that you can see is shown approximately aligned with the south door of the Lady Chapel. And this orientation was assisted by photograph 1, which shows the Lady Chapel south door in the background. And photograph 2 confirms the location of the triangular trench across St Michael's Chapel in relation to the diagonal trench. So you can see how it's been possible to draw things together. In addition, some trenches were also evident on the geophysical survey, and I'll show an example in relation to the diagonal trench a little bit later. So in 1904, when the abbey was still in private hands, Sir William St John Hope carried out limited excavations published in the Archaeological Journal. Following the purchase of the site on behalf of the Church of England in 1907, the excavation committee appointed Frederick Bligh Bond, and the main purpose of his excavations was to expose monastic buildings, buried monastic buildings, but he also investigated some specific areas that he was interested in, such as the area to the east of the church here. And he published 10 reports in the Sands proceedings. And most of Bond's archive is dispersed, but some of the records which we do have expand the evidence in the reports, particularly regarding the extent of his excavations. Oh. Okay, excavations were resumed in 1926, and the director was Theodore Fife, and his excavations were dominated by the discovery of the Saxon and some of the Norman churches in this area here. And he published 2 reports in the Sands proceedings. Between 1928 and 1939, excavations were directed by Sir Charles Pears, Sir Alfred Clapham and Abbot Horn, with William Wedlake as foreman. Initially, they extended Fife's work in the medieval nave, and uncovering a lot more of the Saxon church. But they also explored new areas in subsequent years, particularly the chapter house, exposing the plan of the dormitory, the rear dorter, the abbot's lodging, the monk's kitchen here, and this area to the west of the refectory. They published 9 short reports and summaries in the Sands proceedings, which only offer a fraction of the information that they actually excavated. The most revealing records, I think, from the 20s and 30s have been the numerous unpublished photographs and plans, which have been particularly useful in unpicking the archaeological evidence for the Saxon churches from the published reconstruction. So this photograph shows the Saxon church beneath the medieval nave. The excavation committee reconvened in 1950, and Raleigh Radford was appointed as director. And the focus of these excavations was exploring evidence predating the Great Fire of 1184. And he mostly used targeted narrow trenches, as you can see. He only published 6 short summaries, and in 1981 a more extensive interim report focused again on the evidence predating the fire. And finally we have William Wedlake, who excavated the parts of the Abbot's Hall in 1978 to 79 and never published anything. His records, well, there are gaps in his records, but we have been able to reassess his claims for discovering Saxon and Norman remains in this area, and crucially develop a more coherent account of the 14th century Abbot's range. So this whole area here, the Abbot's kitchen, the Abbot's lodging, and the Abbot's hall. He's also got there's an extensive number of excavation photographs, and you can see he went somewhat beyond his remit of only removing superficial deposits. So the limited, often biased nature of the published material has been a major stumbling block to scholarly assessment of the excavations. And while Radford's 1981 paper went further, placing the early remains within an Irish-Celtic context, attempting an interpretation of the Anglo-Saxon evidence, which we'll hear more about later from Roberta, and suggesting comparative churches for the Norman phases, it's all extremely limited. But both Wedlake and Radford intended to produce a full excavation report of the entire historic excavations. The NMR archive actually does contain some draft chapters written as late as the 1990s, and bear in mind Radford died in 1998, but unfortunately a book never appeared. So we're now going to take a close look at Radford's archive. So, as I've mentioned, Radford's archive offers the most potential for understanding the archaeology, and therefore is the focus of the remainder of this paper. He actually excavated approximately 103 trenches represented here, and a few test holes as well, across the monastic buildings. And with the exception of the excavations of 1964, these have now all been tied in to the plan of the Abbey. And I'll explain why there's a problem with 1964 a little bit later. So the analysis of the records has presented both interpretative and logistical challenges. The interim reports have been regarded as factual without verification of the archaeological material. However, Radford used the archaeology to try and prove the historical framework rather than using history and archaeology as separate but complementary sources of evidence. Consequently, the approach taken during this project has been to disentangle the archaeology from Radford's assumptions, which has been extremely difficult. There's also the inherent problem of trying to interpret features within narrow exploratory trenches, and this has led to some reassessment, particularly where buildings have been reconstructed from fragmentary evidence, and I'll show an example of this later. The archive was found to be predominantly complete, but the records and finds were completely disconnected. And added to this, we also have correspondence and the attempts at publication, which has created an additional and daunting mountain of material. I also found there were contradictions in later years, particularly as some of the assumptions were revisited, and it's just trying to work back to the primary sources. It's amounted to a forensic examination to establish the evidence and reconstruct from first principles. Just a note on the reliability of the records, the level of accuracy was actually found to be fairly reasonable, reflecting improvements in archaeological technique in the 1950s, but there is a lack of consistency, and this could partly be down to a lack of established procedure on the site. So I mentioned 1964, and Radford did open up a couple of large areas, as you can see from the plan, but he didn't seem to know how to deal with it, so how to record it. So for 1964, we have no plans, so we don't know exactly where this trench is, except it was across the Abbot Hall, and we have no sections. So we have an awful lot of pottery in particular, and notes, but we just can't tie it into anything. So this is the only year I've been really unhappy with. I've also found that there's been a lack of understanding when it comes to stratigraphy displayed in some of the section drawings. Most of them have been okay. Also, the site photographer would only visit once during a season, so it's very hit and miss as to what they recorded. Some trenches and features have worked very well represented, others are completely absent. We have nothing at all from 1962 to 1964, apart from photographs that we've been given by volunteers, snapshots really. The policy for recording finds context is also unfortunate, as Radford's prime objective was the evidence predating the fire. He didn't routinely record contextual information for deposits later than that. The records also reflect Radford's belief that he alone would be writing up the findings, and therefore that the records didn't need necessarily to make sense to anyone else. So the first step in this project has been to link the records together, and it's taken a couple of years to do this. So I'm just going to illustrate this through one trench, actually just the Cloister 2 trench of 1956. This is the area in the northeast corner of the Cloister Garth, and down in the left-hand corner here is our new digitised version of the same area. In the inset is a flying buttress and its foundation. This is the section drawing that goes with this trench, and you can see we've got a rubble core here. That is the same feature. We were then able to tie some with a photograph, and you can see in the inset we have the same masonry. This is Radford's main site notebook, and on the right-hand side you can see it says Trench CL2, Cloister 2, and this also illustrates the difficulties we've had in transcribing the notebooks. It's very cramped handwriting, it's been extremely difficult. This shot of Radford actually shows him with his section board and this very notebook at the foot of the section board. And this is one of the fines envelopes held at the Abbey that I mentioned earlier, and it says slag in the corner, it says Cloister 2, and these are using these measurements and this description here, dark clay, we've actually been able to link it to a clay layer above what was thought to be another furnace structure. I should say a furnace structure, one of the blast furnace structures that we're going to hear more about later. Okay, so that just shows how that is an essential first step in bringing all the evidence together. So during the pilot project, it also became apparent that we needed a database to process all the records. So we chose to use the Integrated Archaeological Database developed by Mike Rains at the York Archaeological Trust, and it was specifically adapted to be able to take section drawings as opposed to single context plans. So within the IADB, we applied modern practice to the primary field records to make them usable. So this, I digitised this section here and applied context numbers, and this is the clay that I mentioned above what was thought to be a furnace, but it's very unconvincing. This is the context record that goes with that clay. This is the fines record from that clay, which relates to the envelope I showed you earlier. And this is a photograph of, specifically of that, what was thought to be a furnace structure. The new fines assessments have also provided a limited dating framework, allowing the phasing and stratigraphy to be properly assessed. So we've been able to create loose matrices, which have been really helpful in writing the new excavation reports. The only record-based post-excavation process undertaken outside of the IADB has been the plotting of the excavation trenches, which has been done in AutoCAD and Illustrator. But the planned features were also linked to the IADB via the context numbers. The geophysical survey has comprised a magnetometer and resistance survey of the whole precinct with more targeted ground-penetrating radar, but this is a time slice of at a depth of 1 metre to 1.5 metres. I mean, you can see we still covered a very good area of the ground, certainly covering all the known monastic buildings and some additional areas. And this has confirmed the location of some excavation trenches. So in the green inset here, you can see the diagonal trench I mentioned before, and a close-up here. And it's also shown the number of unexcavated buildings at the site, and many of which correspond with the Parchmark survey undertaken by Charlie and Nancy Hollenrake. So let's move on to case study. Okay. So the two Norman churches at Glastonbury Abbey have been extensively discussed in Radford's 1981 report, and they were accompanied by these two reconstruction drawings. This plan shows how Radford thought Abbot Thurston's church may have looked, and this is based on only 3 features which he said predated the 12th century remains and were unrelated to the pre-conquest layout. For the 12th century, there are more elements. The 12th century church was built by Abbot Herluin and completed by Abbot Henry Dubois. I have to say, in fairness to Radford, in addition to the outer walls shown here, there were also several features relating to internal arrangements, which we'll look at later, and the mortar bedding of the 12th century church has also been recorded in many of the trenches. We also have explorations by Bond in 1908, I think, yes, and he identified the west wall of the 12th century church just inside the west wall of the 13th century church. And this was confirmed by the 1926 to 28 excavations, which also found evidence for the arcades and for the south aisle wall. And they also found evidence for flooring. They also found flooring with evidence of fire damage relating to the 1184 fire. And the flooring is here. And crucially, this was above the Saxon church, but approximately a metre below the 13th century nave floor. And the nave was actually raised up by about a metre following the fire, I should say. So although there is more evidence for the later Norman church, the striking fact is that Radford's plans are extremely elaborate in relation to the limited archaeological evidence. Also, the plans are shown in isolation from the medieval church. Also, the 12th century church is not shown with its contemporary claustral remains, as we'll shortly see. With the excavation trenches now accurately plotted, we could tie in the features in the trenches with the corresponding published features. So here we have Radford's plan of Thurston's church with his 3 features. And here we have Radford's plan of the 12th century church. And this just allows us to see the conjectural reconstruction plans in relation to the standing remains and to each other, which does appear to support Radford's belief that we have a minimum of 3 different buildings. However, how reliable is this evidence? This plan shows the 3 features identified by Radford as late 11th century. So we have 1, 2, 3, plus one other possibility, which is in the records but never made it to the publication. Stratigraphically, I can only accept that the apsidal feature, seen here, which we'll look at in more detail, and the masonry in robber trench in this trench here, could actually be late 11th century. This feature was actually sealed beneath 12th century deposits. And there's also evidence for an internal pier, or a pier just here, because there's a gap between this feature and the north edge of the trench, comprising natural clay, which is quite interesting. And also the shape of the apse is also fairly convincing. A photograph now linked to this particular to the north transept trench here, does show some in situ masonry. This is Radford, and Peter points right down here. Although the feature was predominantly robbed, but this is actually relates to the chord of the apse here, and you can see in plan we've got a springing of the apse here. If we look in section of the same trench across the north transept, the 11th century features are shown in 2 shades of the lighter green, and the darker shade reflecting more certain dating. And the very dark green is 12th century. So in the inset, the apsidal feature is sealed. This apsidal feature is sealed beneath a 12th century deposit, and also the excavation notes do describe the 12th century wall trench cutting through the end of the apse, but we don't actually see that in the section. For the 12th century church, we have features unrelated to the 13th century plan, mostly located in the centre of the later bay divisions, and there's evidence of 4 apsidal endings here, 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 and here. Stratigraphically, all these features are pre-13th century, and if we look at the north transept trench, we can see the 12th century features are dark green, and the post-fire church is in the blue, and we can see that, well, the 2 points I'd like to make is that the 13th century trenches actually cut through, they're on the eastern side. Sorry, I should start that again. The robbed 12th century foundation trenches were cut to the east by the 13th century construction trenches. So inset 1 actually shows a 12th century foundation cut on its eastern side by the foundation for the later church. Also, the 12th century features shown here and here are overlain by 13th century mortar bedding. So the 13th century transepts were built immediately alongside of the 12th century transepts, and that's the major point I'd like to make. Moving on to the claustral ranges, so this is all the evidence in plan of the 12th century features. We also have lots of mortar bedding, layers and paving and things that don't show up in the plan. And again, I should say the features are all stratigraphically earlier than the fire of 1184, and we have the same pattern as observed for the church. The post-fire buildings are built immediately alongside their earlier counterparts. So we have the 12th century chapter house built immediately west of its later replacement. We have the cloister walks. The north cloister walk is in the same position, and the west cloister walk, but the east cloister walk is immediately west of its later counterpart, which you can see running down here. So that's the earlier and that's the later. And the south cloister walk is also slightly in from the later one. And both these positions have been confirmed by results from the ground penetrating radar survey. So they were retaining, we should say that there's the dormitory, and we have the same pattern again. It's located immediately west of the later dormitory. The refectory, we don't have all the walls for that, and I'll come to that in a second. They were retaining the Norman plan, which eased the rebuilding process because the monastery could still function, and the masonry could have been transferred into the new buildings, and this has been confirmed by excavations, which have shown a large quantity of Romanesque masonry in the surviving later foundations. We also have a very interesting range of rooms over to the west of the refectory. These were first recorded, let's look in more detail, these were first recorded in 1938 and 39 and were still exposed in 1952. So this photograph shows one of these walls. A 12th century date was concluded by the excavators based on stratigraphic location beneath the later refectory. And also the use of tall burr foundations with yellow mortar, which are thought to be fairly representative of the 12th century build. Interestingly, it was noted that there was no evidence of the 1184 fire in this area, which would suggest these buildings may relate to a chamber and chapel built by Abbot Robert in 1171 to 78 and fed by Adam of Domeran to have survived the fire together with Henry de Bar's bell tower. The problem with this is that the recording of this area is very limited, and the only conclusion that I can securely draw is that the southern room here with internal response, was contemporary with the 12th century refectory, and we have a passageway here and a wall here, and a room here, and a couple of other possible walls here. And that the whole range was demolished prior to the construction of the early 14th century Abbots Hall over here. I should also say that Wedlake did actually find some substantial masonry beneath the west wall of the earlier Abbots Hall, which was sealed beneath very deep deposits relating to the fire. So we've got another substantial structure further west. So we're currently considering whether the buildings could represent a west range. The published plans of the Glastonbury cloister always show the west side of the cloister without a range, but this would be highly unusual for a Benedictine monastery. Another area of interest has been within the cloister garth. Radford claims to have found a bell tower. We have a wall coming down here, and there's a wall there and a wall there. The problem of narrow trenches. There's actually two phases of structural remains, the first of which probably is 12th century. And this photograph shows the masonry within trench. So we do have a structure of some sort here. But the form of this structure is impossible to reconstruct from the limited remains within the narrow trenches, but we are considering that it may be a conduit house. So in conclusion, I've demonstrated why the archive project represents an important milestone in our understanding of Glastonbury Abbey. I've highlighted the key objective of establishing a set of independent archaeological evidence, as opposed to the previous assumptions based on an historical framework. This was illustrated by examining the evidence for the Norman monastery, which also exemplifies the unpublished archaeological evidence for the 12th century cloisters, including evidence for a west range and possible conduit house. Crucially, this illustrates, I hope, how reassessment of the excavation archive is addressing the existing narratives of Glastonbury Abbey and bringing new evidence to the forefront.